isn't this just special privileges? Aren't you just asking for something that Christians get and no one else gets? And only if you've thought deeply about the connectedness of religious liberty to your faith as a Christian will you be able to give the winsome answer that starts unlocking doors and opening doors for people to be more open to hear what Jesus Christ wants them to hear. And then the final thing in your packet is an FAQ document, which can just be helpful if you're talking with your congregation or you want to orient people. I think that may be something that you can make some use of. Well, let me start in now on the practical tips. And I'm going to start, not surprisingly, at the first tip. If you look in, every once in a while, we start in the right place. When we recommend to nonprofits what they need to do to be prepared for this challenging legal environment, the starting place is your organizational documents. You need to review your organizational documents and make sure that your religious identity and your religious rights are clearly articulated. Now, how do you do this? Well, I want to get you thinking in terms of a hierarchy of documents. Begin with your foundational documents, governing documents. So those are, for us, of course, Constitution and canons, which I have to say in both an ACNA and a DOMA setting are in pretty good shape. But those may be at a congregational level, your articles of incorporation or your charter or your constitution. They may be your bylaws. They may be mission statements, vision statements, statements of faith. But look at those and make sure that those are clear and unmistakable in identifying you as a church, as a religious ministry, and as a religious ministry with certain beliefs. Now, I'll come back in a minute to statements about particular issues. But let me go then to your second level of review. And this is where you need to look at all of your documentation that's provided to your employees and your volunteers. So think in terms of employee handbooks, policy manuals, codes of conduct, specific policies such as anti-harassment policies, and even down to the level of your specific job descriptions. Now, there's less risk for a church than for another religious nonprofit, in part for the reasons I talked about this morning. But often we lose sight of the fact that there are religious motivations and underpinnings and often requirements for every position that you have. You have a right in employment to take religious criteria into account, and I'll explain that in a minute, but it's useful to be thinking about each position. What is the purpose of that position and how does it relate to accomplishment of the reason God has called us into being? Well, let me take you to a third level of review. At the next level, you want to be thinking about the face the church presents to the public. And here this can mean both governmental filings, IRS filings or state filings, but increasingly, perhaps predominantly these days, it's your website. It may be promotional materials, it may be flyers, but really your website is where the world comes to look at you and to find out who you are. And you want to make sure that what you say on your website is consistent with what you've said internally, that it reflects your visions and value statements. You also want to make sure that it doesn't say anything that you didn't really mean to say in a public setting. And this is an area that I think can get very interesting. You're trying to reach out to your community. You're trying to present a winsome and inviting face. And sometimes the way you talk about something can draw people in, or it can sort of put up barriers. So as you're articulating your religious identity, articulate it to the public in a way that is drawing them towards you. Now, there's no bright line rule there, and the legal implications of it are more in the negative sense. If you don't identify yourself as true to your religious convictions, that's one piece of evidence against you. If you do, that's one piece of evidence for you, but when you do it in a way that is winsomely communicating. Now, why should you do this? Let me give you sort of the legal reason for the practical tip. First of all, if there's ever any legal challenge that you're facing, this gives you a stronger basis to assert legal defenses that are available to you under the religion clauses of the First Amendment, under state constitutions, and under laws like the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which we have a federal one. There's one in place in Virginia, for example. Proof of your religious identity, proof that it's strong and your religious convictions can be absolutely vital in a lawsuit. And it can be vital both in a technical sense, you have to prove your claims, but frankly, it can be vital in a relational or a persuasive sense. Cases are decided by judges and juries. Judges and juries are human beings. If who you are as a Christian ministry is so imbued in all that you say about yourself, it is very hard for them to miss the point that you took the position you took because your understanding is that God required it, or that it was a way to be faithful. The organizations that get into trouble are the ones that look like their requirements, their codes of conduct, their employment standards are kind of pasted on or papered over, and they don't really go to the heart of who you are. Well, there's a second reason that this is helpful, and that is it actually lets you invoke specific legal exemptions. There's under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that prohibits discrimination on a number of bases: race, sex, ethnicity, nationality, religion. But there is an exception to the prohibition on discrimination in employment based on religion for a, quote, religious organization. So you want to be able to show we are a religious organization. We get this Section 702 exemption. Now, the good news is, I think most of you are probably here on behalf of churches. You're kind of at the heart of that exemption. But it doesn't hurt to have that available. And one of the reasons that exemption is so valuable is it is entity-wide. It applies to every position in the church. There's an additional or a separate exception called the ministerial exception that courts have recognized. And that one says that a church has an absolute right to select its own ministers, to select those who lead it and who speak for it. But the Section 702 exemption from Title VII, the beauty of that is it goes down to your janitor. And in fact, the leading Supreme Court case that upheld that law involved a janitor at a gymnasium connected with a Mormon temple. So it's a very powerful exemption as long as you are able to come within it. Now, one other aspect of this exemption that is a reason it's so important, it is very broad. It applies to not only your religious activities, but your secular activities. So it applies to your janitors. It applies to people who may not be doing religious tasks. And religion is very broadly defined. The language in the statute is all aspects of religious observance and practice, as well as belief. Now, a couple of practical points here. As you gather this information, do it carefully. Don't generate new information that could be used against you. If you notice a problem with your documents, don't generate a lot of emails back and forth saying, oh, this is really bad, this could be used against us, or, oh no, we just did something really stupid, oh no. Have that conversation face-to-face or by phone. Don't email, don't text, don't write it down. Don't generate bad documentation in your effort to get to good documentation. And then sometimes you think, well, is there specific language that we could use for our bylaws, or is there specific language that we should grab hold of? I'll come back to that in a minute or two under a different topic. Well, I'm going to move to our next topic. This will not be topic number 2. This will go to topic number 3. And here our recommendation is you want to articulate the religious character of and the religious basis for your positions on foundational issues. Now you can think, what are foundational issues? In the last decade, we've come to recognize that issues of marriage, the family, the single life, and human sexuality are foundational issues. They're not the only foundational issues. They're not the foundational issues that the church was dealing with a century or a millennium or 2 millennia ago, but there are current moments foundational issues. And so there may be a need for you to stake out a position on these issues as a basis for actions you take and decisions you make. Now you can think about it, it's not just marriage, it could also include things like off-the-job conduct. Oftentimes what your employees do away from the church can have just as big an impact on your ministry reputation and your outreach as what they do at the church. You want to think, do we need to make a statement on that? Do we need to have a code of conduct or requirement? Now, some recommendations here. You want to explicitly base your positions on Scripture and expressly religious norms. Go deep. Good, thoughtful theology is helpful legally. And you always want to link the position to accomplishing your religious purposes as a church. Now, good news here. In the ACNA, we have some resources that are already at hand. Archbishop Foley Beach set up earlier this year a task force for the ACNA on marriage, the family, and the single life. That task force has 3 subgroups: theological, pastoral, and then legal and public policy. Our theological task group came out with a compendium. It's a 6-page document that starts with Scripture and then goes basically through the Anglican formularies up to present Anglican and ecumenical statements and pulls out all of the statements about marriage. It's literally a one-stop shopping point for all of the information that you need to take a position on this issue. Now, when the Obergefell decision came out in June, the ACNA College of Bishops issued their own statement about the decision. And included as part of that statement was both a litany for churches to pray about marriage and this compendium of all of these sources on marriage. So this is something I would encourage your vestries to look at. You might want to consider adopting a resolution embracing that or reflecting it in some way as your position on the issue of marriage. It's not in your packets, but it is literally linked to on the front page of both the DOMA and the ACNA websites. The College of Bishops statement on marriage. And you'll have to drill down to, I think it's page 5. Let's move forward to our 4th suggestion. And this one is going to the logical next step. You want to articulate the religious character of all of the activities that your church is engaging in. Secular activities, whether they're rescue missions, soup kitchens, provision of aid, are often seen by the surrounding culture as non-religious and therefore as entitled to less protection. And this is an issue that I think rescue missions grapple with on a daily basis. The government and the community around them desperately wants the good they provide of providing beds and food and shelter and training for the homeless. But they really don't think why, they don't understand why do those things have to be connected to a religious organization. And so there's this effort to strip out the religious element. Think about situations in San Francisco or in Massachusetts where Catholic Charities were told, well, we really like what you do in adoption, but you can't have any religious requirements for adoptions. So you need to check your beliefs at the door and then come in and carry out our secular good. Well, you want to make that a more difficult discussion for them by being very clear about how what they think of as secular activities are actually very central to your faith as followers of Christ. We don't have to look far. Scripture is overflowing with that. Jesus feeding, Jesus healing, just about every ministry that your church does, it does because of what the Lord has revealed in Scripture. And you want to articulate that. Now, let me give you a great example of why this comes into play legally. Some of you may have heard about the lawsuit against World Vision out in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals a few years ago, Spencer v. World Vision. And in that lawsuit, World Vision had employees who at hiring had signed the statement of faith, and then somewhere down the road decided, they just didn't really believe that Jesus was God. And yeah, they knew they signed the statement of faith. They wanted to keep working at World Vision, but they weren't going to sign that again. They actually disagreed with it. And World Vision said, we're sorry, but if you're going to work here, it's required that you agree to our statement of faith. So we're going to have to terminate you. The employees sued, former employees sued. One of their arguments was that World Vision was not a religious organization because it was engaged in charitable activity. And the charitable activity it did of feeding people around the world was non-religious charitable activity. Well, the good news is World Vision was prepared for that. So their documents were in magnificent order. And the proof that they put on in the trial court and that held up before the Ninth Circuit was a model for what organizations can do. I still find it stunning that the plaintiffs would have said, we understand who you are better than you understand who you are, but I think we should increasingly be prepared for that risk. I'm going to skip over the next suggestion and go to topic number 6. And these are just a series of maxims that I've found helpful in thinking about how to approach these issues. The governing principle that I want you to understand is as you work through all of these areas of your church, You want to apply your standards with a ruthless consistency. First principle, always treat like cases alike. When you treat one employee different from another employee, and those reasons are not on the face of your policies or your documents, you're creating a basis for that employee to claim discrimination. Now, this is particularly an issue when you deal with the changing standards of marriage. As Sam talked about last night, it's very easy for us to think that the only issue that the church is facing is same-sex marriage, and we forget of everything that's led up to this moment. So if you apply your standards to terminate an employee because of a same-sex marriage status or sexual orientation status, but the basis for those beliefs is a biblical understanding of human sexuality that would treat other forms of sexual sin the same, dealing with those inconsistently creates a legal vulnerability. And so you really want to think through, how do we apply this consistently? Now, this has popped up for years in the area of discrimination on the basis of sex. There are a number of cases with the EEOC where you had a Christian school that terminated a teacher who became pregnant and was not married. And the logic that the school pursued was quite straightforward. You're pregnant, you're not married, there's only one example in all of human history where that has happened without sexual activity. Therefore, you have engaged in sexual activity outside of marriage, which violates our policies, and we're terminating you. Well, that's a defensible position. But if you have male employees who have engaged in sexual activity outside of marriage and you have treated them any differently, you have just engaged in sex discrimination. That's what the EEOC's found. That's what a number of courts have found. That distinction is critical. So treat all of those like cases alike. Don't make exceptions, and don't say theologically certain types of sin are the same and then deal with them with your employees as though they're different. Now, second principle here is use it or lose it. If you apply all of your religious rights, your religious hiring requirements inconsistently, then that can create the argument that you've waived those rights, or that those are not really the reasons for your employment decisions, and in fact that you're discriminating on some other grounds. So again, consistency. Third point, always ask, is this the hill we want to die on? You want to be thoughtful and prayerful about where you impose requirements and when you invoke these exceptions. It's a good idea not to pick fights that you're unlikely to win, and it's an even better idea not to pick fights that you don't really care about the ultimate outcome of that fight. You want to make those decisions early in the process. So when you're thinking, how would I apply these requirements or these standards, figure on the front end, do brainstorming, think, okay, what are all of the situations that could fall under this requirement or under this conduct prohibition, and how would we treat them, and then adjust that position accordingly. And then the final principle here is that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. What I mean by that is you need to not just address these issues at a high level with clergy or vestry or a committee. You need to think, how do we train throughout the church so that we handle these matters consistently and rightly? Most of the employment discrimination and harassment cases that you encounter don't involve the highest level of management. They involve mid-level or frontline supervisors. Some of our churches went through litigation where there's a lot of press interest. And you learn very quickly that the press is not going to call and ask for the person most knowledgeable. They're going to call and start talking to the first person they talk to, often your receptionist. So you want to be thinking, have we trained people so that we know how to handle inquiries or questions and get them to the right person to answer, rather than risk an inconsistent answer? Again, I'll use rescue missions as an example. Often one of the ways that they help people is when a person's gone through their program and there's been some signs of life change, they put them to work. They have them in volunteer roles. So often if you call a soup kitchen or a homeless shelter, the person answering the phone is someone who has been served by the organization and has only recently come in that position. Well, that person probably hasn't been with the organization long enough or known enough to answer difficult questions. You want to channel those questions and you want to train those people. I'm going to jump ahead now to our tip number 8, be careful with the gracious use of your facilities. And the problem here is that if you provide on an unlimited basis or an ad hoc basis your church building or other facilities for use by the community, you run the risk of triggering public accommodations laws or having some governmental agency decide that this is a public accommodation and therefore you can't refuse any group that wants to use it. Now, the origins of those laws are quite good. They were intended to keep the use of facilities from discriminating, for example, on the basis of race. But when the facility is something that you're using for your religious mission, the thought that it would be used for something that's contrary to your religious faith is quite disturbing. And the example that gets talked about the most is a Methodist facility that hosted weddings, made itself available to the whole community. They were then asked to host a same-sex wedding, and they said, we have a conscientious religious objection to the idea of a same-sex marriage. That's a religious ceremony. It would take place in our religious space. We're going to decline. The couple sued. The New Jersey agency responsible for public accommodations laws ruled against the camp and said, no, you must make your facility open. Now, there's some complexities to that case I won't go into at this point, but the simple principle is you can convert a facility that you have into a public accommodation, and that can require that you make it open to the public. Now, the solution is a simple one. You just want to implement and then consistently follow a good policy about use of your facilities. It should be very clear that your facilities are a church or are a religious space. It should invoke your rights as a religious organization, as a church. It should impose religious requirements for the use of the property. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And then it should also establish a clear and reasonable approval process for any outside use. And whether that's going to your vestry or whether it's a committee, you just want a process that lets you say yes or no. Now, let me go back to the religious requirements that you impose. A number of our churches meet in other people's facilities, whether they're public schools or other churches. Often for weddings, we have to borrow someone's sanctuary. And right after Obergefell came down, there was this sort of immediate response. And some churches said, you know what? We're just going to make our facilities available for weddings either only by our members or only by members of our denomination. Now, I've suggested, including to some of those organizations, that that's both over-inclusive and under-inclusive at the same time. Because on the one hand, you're saying, well, if someone's a member of our church, they can get married in our facilities, which shifts the issue to your membership policy. If your membership policy is good, fine. But if your membership policy isn't good, then you may have a problem. You may find that there are people coming for marriage who you wouldn't want to allow to be married. It's also under-inclusive, though, because many churches share your same commitment about the nature of marriage. And so what we've generally recommended is adopt a policy or a procedure or a practice that addresses use of facilities based on commitment to your beliefs and advancement of your mission. That allows you to go broader for other churches. That allows you to go narrower if there's someone in your church who doesn't believe that or agree with that. I'm going to take a moment here to go down a little bit of a rabbit trail, that membership point about your membership process. Literally just at the break, I was chatting with Christine Jones, and she was mentioning to me something that Restoration Anglican is doing, where they are engaging in interviews with people coming for membership. And I know, Kevin, you're on the vestry there. You may be able to provide some added, or not added insight into it. It sounded to me like a marvelous idea, because what they're saying is part of membership is that we know that you actually believe what we believe and are committed to our mission. And so rather than just have it be a check the box, we're going to engage with you. And we may ask you tough questions. You may ask us tough questions. But at the end of the day, neither of us will be confused about where we are or what we believe. I think that's a very creative idea about one approach to solve some of these problems. You could have a similar process for marriage, whether it's marriages performed by your clergy or use of your facilities. And I'd like to encourage us. I mean, my hope for these sessions is they'll get you all thinking and all of us talking, what are creative ways that we can protect ourselves legally, but actually be advancing ministry and faithful ministry at the same time. I'm going to skip over some other tips that I think are more relevant either to non-churches or to lawyers and those interested in the inside baseball game. Let me jump ahead to tip 13, and then I'm going to want to talk a little bit about, I want to open it up for question and answer. Then I'll come back to talk a little bit about the front lines areas I talked about. Our tip 13 is to be vigilant and guard your flanks. And here's what I mean by that. As I mentioned this morning, there is a lot going on politically, legally, and culturally. It can be dizzying to keep up with all of it. There are going to be efforts to pass or amend laws at federal, state, local levels. There are going to be efforts to get people in political positions at all of those levels that will have significant implications. Those of us in Fairfax County probably are all aware of what went on with the Fairfax County School Board over the last 6 months. The issue for those of you not in Fairfax County, the school board adopted an amendment to its anti-discrimination policy that added sexual orientation and gender identity to the categories against which that are prohibited forms of discrimination. Now, I'm a parent of children in the Fairfax County Public School System. We have been trying for 10 years to get the school system to move the start time back by 1 hour. There is undeniable, uncontroverted, overwhelming evidence that that is a good thing to do, that it is beneficial across demographic categories. So it doesn't matter your ethnicity, it doesn't matter your gender, it doesn't matter your family wealth, doesn't matter if you're a recent immigrant or you've been here for 200 years. Everybody does better. And there's evidence that in the school districts that have adopted that change, SAT scores went up 100 points or more across the board. And as the guy who was getting up to drive my kids to school at 7:10 in the morning, I know my IQ went up significantly. 10 years, multiple hearings, multiple school board meetings to get that change. The change to the anti-discrimination policy was proposed in one meeting at the end of April and approved at the next meeting at the beginning of May. Now, supposedly there was notice given, but I went back through every email or bulletin I received as a parent and could find nothing until after the fact. Some of you, I think, have been very involved in this issue. You can write volumes. Well, it was a great example that eternal vigilance, sadly, is the price of liberty. And a process was essentially engineered in order to close down debate, to decrease democratic representation, to decrease parental involvement, and to achieve a result. Now, the lawyers in the room can sort of start smiling and thinking about there's now a change to your policy on discrimination without a clear track record or explanation even of the meaning of the terms you've adopted, let alone any sort of legislative history. And creative lawyers can think of very creative lawsuits that could be brought under this policy against teachers or staff or administrators that would have very significant negative impacts for the schools. It's exactly the reason that these sort of changes are normally discussed and explored, and that you listen to the voices asking the questions. That's not what happened here. So it's given a fresh lesson to those of us in Fairfax about the need to be monitoring and to be vigilant. A second area that I'd flag, and particularly because so many people in our churches work in Washington, D.C. and in the government, you always want to watch for that massive outpouring of new regulations and new agency guidance that federal administrative agencies issue at the end of an administration. And particularly if the election is not a close election. If it's one-sided in either direction, there is no reason that the outgoing administration can't take a very strong shot at doing whatever they want to do to get guidance in some form that advances the issues that are near and dear to their heart. So we are now in an election cycle. I would encourage all of you, and particularly all of you who are doing anything that's either involved in the government or watching the government, this is the time for high vigilance. Watch what's coming down and be prepared for it. The third area is guard your supply lines. After the Obergefell oral argument, there was a lot of concern about tax-exempt status of churches that oppose same-sex marriage. It was based on a question that was asked of the Solicitor General at the oral argument, kind of a softball question. He could have avoided it. He could have given a really nice answer where they said, well, what about organizations that oppose same-sex marriage? If this becomes the law of the land, do they risk what happened to Bob Jones University over the issue of race? And his response was, that will be an issue, Your Honor. That was chilling. I actually think that is less of an immediate threat. I think that's a down-the-road threat. I think there are mechanisms that would be used to fight that. But something that got on very few people's radar was that in the prior Congress, part of the comprehensive tax reform efforts would have essentially pulled away the charitable contribution tax deduction. So there are sometimes things that get our attention, but at the same time, there are other threats that don't get on our radar that could have just as dangerous an impact. So I'd encourage you, when you're watching, watch at a deep level. And then a final point I'd say is be aware of and support the work of what I like to call the watchmen on the walls. There are organizations that keep an eye on what's going on. There are organizations that help inform the public. Be aware of them, engage with them, find the ones that you feel are most conducive to your interests and work with them. And help them as they try to help you. Well, I think this is a good point for me to pause and open it up to questions or comments or thoughts. If you do have any, please go to the microphone, or Corky may try and bring it to you. I'm happy to also go to other suggestions that I didn't talk about, but my thought was I'd like you to drive that discussion and make sure that we're speaking to your needs.
Susan Verdig-Dykes from Falls Church Anglican. I'm wondering about things like ESOL and evangelism activities that where we'd be wanting to bring people in who are not Christian, who might be Muslim or something else, and how that would affect things. And also, in our case, having tenants in our building.
On the first question, I think you're on reasonably safe ground for outward-looking ministries. The distinction that's most significant is the difference between those who are your employees or volunteers and those whom you serve. And your legal rights are stronger in using religious criteria for your employees, or by extension your volunteers. You are perhaps a little more constrained when you are thinking, who do we serve? Now, if you're completely private, you can actually impose some requirements or some limitations on whom you serve. I suspect our churches wouldn't care about doing that because we are trying broad outreach. But for example, an ESOL program, it's a perfectly legitimate requirement to say, well, our ESOL program is a Spanish ESOL program. So we limit participation to those who are actually speaking Spanish or learning Spanish, but where Spanish is the issue. The distinction that says we don't have any Sanskrit speakers in our program is a defensible distinction. But in general, when you're reaching out, those whom you serve, you can think of as the broad area, and then those who are doing the serving is where you say, these are the people that are speaking for us and that are representing our church, and that's where we could use religious criteria.
I was referring to number 8 about the use of the facilities.
Oh, I'm sorry, Susan. I misunderstood your question. I think that's the area where we'd want to make sure that it's being dealt with under a facilities use policy. So you want to be thinking, who is using it? How are they using it? How does that fit with our mission or our ministry? It's an issue many churches are facing with regard to Boy Scout or Girl Scout troops, where the standards for those troops have changed. And the reality is that you can do that and manage that risk, but you want to make sure that you've thought about how we're doing it. And so as I say, a policy is one very important point. Another thing to do is to think about how often do we review that relationship. You know, in the past, you might have signed up a Girl Scout troop and not thought about it for 10 years. You might even have an agreement for a certain term. I'd encourage you to be thinking, maybe this is an annual agreement. Maybe we just look at it each year. And since it's our choice of how to make limited use of our facilities available, maybe in a particular year we say, you know, we've decided that the Girl Scouts just aren't really the best use for that time. We have another use for that facility. So it goes back to, in that sense, the vigilance point. And then you had a second aspect of your question that I think... Tenants. Oh, tenants. That's a specialized issue that I probably would be better to speak about on a individual basis. It is one that I think has been thought about by churches where it's relevant. You are more constrained as a commercial landlord than you are in other settings. There are still some rights that are available. But that maybe the best thing to do is to say that's a very good issue to flag for any of our churches that may be leasing space for something other than religious ministries.
Take that side.
John?
Yeah, Scott, question, you almost hit the answer here. Boy Scouts, somebody comes to you and says, okay, we know that Boy Scouts have changed their policy on a national level. We would like you to allow us to use your facility to house a Boy Scout organization. It's not necessarily part of your church, but part of the community service. What do you do? Yes or no?
I can't give you a yes or no answer because obviously that's an issue for prayer for the church. I also can't claim to be an expert on the Boy Scout situation, but providentially, I was on a panel discussion several weeks ago with my friend Forrest Norman, who's connected with the Presbyterian Lay Committee. They actually did an amicus brief in the appeals in our cases in church property, who is an expert on the Boy Scouts, has been a troop sponsor, and has had all 4 of his sons go through that. And to do a horrible injustice to Forrest by summarizing an hour of good discussion into about 1 minute. The basic idea would be look at the charter for the Boy Scouts organization, and for that particular chapter, there are provisions in that that allow the chapters to make decisions that may not fully reflect the national policy. So the troop itself may be able to make a distinction from the recent change in policy. If the troop makes that distinction, then that's probably a better fit for your church. If the troop doesn't make that distinction, then you might say that's not the best fit for our church. Even if the troop makes that distinction, things can change. And so, just as we were saying in the context of other programs, you probably want whatever the agreement is to renew on an annual basis.
Scouting does renew on an annual basis.
Thank you.
It does require the institution to sign each year on the charter renewal.
Excellent, thank you. Just for the recording, the comment was scouting actually does require renewal on an annual basis. Boy Scouts, so that solves for that issue. I think.
AJ Nolte with Christ the Savior. I have a quick comment and also a question. The comment is when you're talking about tips and you're talking about religious freedom, we've talked, and I think the legal discussion has been excellent, but we need to also pay attention to the rhetoric that we're using and the way we discuss religious freedom. I think you alluded to that at the beginning. And I think it's very, very important for us to be emphasizing the universality of religious freedom and emphasizing that this is not only for Christians, but is for people of all religious groups and none, because that rhetorically is the thing that comes up, the special pleading, exactly as you made reference to. So we need to, I think, rhetorically also make sure that we're saying, look, we believe this is for everyone. We believe this is for the mosque just as much as it is for the church, because that also, when we're making those arguments, that strengthens our arguments and our claims. My question was, there's a bundle of cases coming up, kind of headlined by the Little Sisters of the Poor case, I guess. What implications do you think that might have for churches and parachurch organizations post-Obergefell?
You're talking about the 7 cases where the Supreme Court just granted cert to review not the religious exemption to the contraceptive mandate, but the religious accommodation under the contraceptive mandate.
Yes, thanks.
I think those cases may not immediately have application to our churches, except to the extent that you're covered by the Affordable Care Act and have not qualified for the religious exemption, which seems unlikely to me. But I think what they are is giving an insight into the long-term direction that the Supreme Court is going to go on the question of whom is protected by religious freedom rights. So the Hobby Lobby case was a very, very good case. The result was quite encouraging in recognizing that religious exercise applies to a for-profit activity engaged in by persons exercising their religious faith. This is now the next step over, the accommodation. limitations on the Hobby Lobby decision. The Hobby Lobby decision was a RFRA, Religious Freedom Restoration Act decision. It was not a constitutional decision. It didn't apply the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. So in that sense, although we have helpful guidance that you can engage in the exercise of religion in a for-profit setting, that principle was not linked specifically to the First Amendment. Which means if RFRA were to be amended or repealed, then we're essentially starting uphill again on that issue under a First Amendment argument. The second thing that I think is going to be interesting is the question of the burden on religion. Because to oversimplify a complex matter, what the Affordable Care Act is requiring is that the Little Sisters of the Poor and others get out from the requirement to provide contraceptive coverage by signing off on a certification that they give to the insurance company that's providing their benefits, saying, we object, now you must provide this to our employees at your expense rather than us having it provided at our expense. And their argument is that is still a burden on their religious exercise because it requires them to have a role, to be complicit in the provision of contraception. Well, it's funny, I was reading some of the articles on it, and I read one from the very liberal perspective that said this case is a slam dunk for us. And this will shoot down this idea that there's any burden here, there's any sort of problem. And then I read one coming from the religious perspective that said this case is a slam dunk because it's so clear that it substantially burdens the exercise of the Little Sisters of the Poor. Who knows what it is? We should be praying and fasting that the outcome will respect the religious liberty of all Americans. And you know, if you saw who I picked for the World Series this year, you wouldn't want my predictions about what the outcome is likely to be. I'm not sure that anybody knows at this point, quite frankly. So I think we should just pray and watch. Yes?
I had a question from putting your DOMA Chancellor hat on. Are the tips that you provided, especially the ones in the beginning, going to be provided to churches? And a reason, from the DOMA perspective, and the reason I ask is because we have a handful of clergy here, but for most of our smaller churches, they are the CEO, they are the organization. Vestries come, vestries go, and especially senior wardens and junior wardens, especially senior wardens, are usually in their third year or their last year of wardenship, and they come to Synod at the end of their senior wardens, and they're gone in a month. So the question is, how, from a DOMA Chancellor perspective, is there any idea about, especially in those complex HR questions, about how we can actually put these into effective use over the next few months beyond Synod?
Great question. What DOMA has been doing is trying to make all of these resources easily available and accessible. So there is a page on the website that the marvelous Mary Ailes, who does so much of our communications, has set up. You'll find there all of the documents that you get now, audio recordings of the sessions of Synod, additional resources as they become available. I'll also be sending out in the near term, wearing my hat as ACNA Chancellor, just a compendium of resources for churches. And so that will include both the ones that we've created, specifically for the ACNA churches, but also just linking to the very helpful materials that others have produced. Alliance Defending Freedom has some very good materials. Christian Legal Society has some excellent materials that are available. I smile because some of the key players in both of those organizations are members of our churches, so our churches are involved. And so all of those are available and should extend beyond the lifetime of one particular vestry term. So they're all there and they all can be helpful. I also want to keep getting the conversations going on because, for example, a smaller mission church can gain an enormous amount of insight by talking to a larger church that's dealt with these issues. And just practical advice, we did this, it was a really great idea, we tried this, it really didn't work well, you may want to just go in this direction. Or we've adopted this policy, we're happy to let you have a copy of it and look at it. You need to make your own decision, does it meet your needs, but you've got a really good starting point. And let me do one editorial comment there. One of the tips I didn't talk about, but it's relevant when you think about borrowing policies from other organizations. I think this is tip number 7. Harassment policies are different. Most churches get an off-the-shelf anti-harassment policy. You need a policy because not having a harassment policy is per se liability for sexual harassment if it occurs. But when you take a one-size-fits-all policy, it treats quote-unquote religious harassment just like any other form of harassment. Now, the law of harassment has developed in the area of sexual harassment. So most policies have language that talk about harassment being unwelcome comments. Well, of course, to say to someone, you're a sinner just like me, and you need the saving grace of Jesus Christ, can be an exceedingly unwelcome comment. Under a harassment policy, that can be harassment. Now, in a secular workplace, that may be appropriate. I'm not sure I agree it's completely appropriate. Frankly, I think that mismanners is a better solution to most of these issues, just courtesy and politeness, the golden rule. But in a church, to say that telling people something that is unwelcome is harassment is essentially waving away, as a matter of policy, core First Amendment rights. And I've actually had to deal with a case where the EEOC was trying to pursue discrimination, harassment, and retaliation claims against a church that prayed for its janitor. Janitor got terminated a month later because the company he was working for, the subcontractor, realized he was only showing up for work about half the time. They terminated him. He brought a complaint. EEOC got involved, started investigating, demanding all sorts of information and evidence. We got pulled in, and my comment to them was, this is a church. They have a right to do whatever they want to do based on religion. Pushback from the EEOC agent. I said, would you like me to give you a case about this? She said, it was a janitor. What are we doing? I said, I can give you a Supreme Court case involving a janitor. Send her the case. No response. I said, look, I'd like to brief the issue. I will give you a brief explaining to you why you don't have jurisdiction for an investigation. Sent the brief. She took it to her superiors, came back and said, we're going forward. Said, are there particular issues or questions? Can I brief those? Sent another brief. She said, thanks for the brief. We're going forward with the investigation. So we filed suit in federal district court. And as soon as it was assigned to a U.S. attorney from the Department of Justice, they looked at it and they called us up and they said, so how quickly could we make this lawsuit go away? If we had the agency issue their letter saying that they were not proceeding with the investigation, it's called a right to sue letter because it means the individual can sue, but the EEOC is not going to. If we gave you your letter, would that persuade you to dismiss the case? And we said, absolutely. Where were you 3 months ago when we started this process? But that's why in that area of the harassment policy, you want to treat religion differently. And we provided a sample policy like 3 or 4 years ago to churches. That's probably something that we can make available again as a useful guide. But it's a good example. When you borrow an off-the-shelf policy, if it has any way of touching on religion, don't assume that you can go with that policy. Sorry, that was a bit of a digression from the question. Other questions?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm Emerson Champion from the Fellowship of Christ the Savior in Towson, Maryland. I'm the senior warden there. And we don't have a rector as yet, so I'm basically the leader of the church as far as the administrative side would go. And we have articles of incorporation in the state of Maryland, but we don't have a 501c3, we don't have bylaws or anything like that other than the constitutions and canons. We do have mission, vision, and core value statements. Do we need to get ourselves on board with our own bylaws and policies and things like that to cover ourselves?
It would be worth taking steps. You may have to take them a few at a time, but it would be good to more clearly define your governance. I would do that in connection with the process of being a mission in the diocese and then becoming a congregation. That process should help you in that direction. You don't need to apply for your own 501c3 status.
Right.
For, obviously churches are automatically exempt. The diocese is also pursuing group exemption status, so it can provide that letter to all of the churches. But I would encourage you to be thinking, what are the statements that we need to define our governance and to define our mission and to define our position on certain issues, and then triage those, prioritize them, and figure out which ones do we get to first.
Right, because right now we're renting space from another church, in another denomination, and we don't have any employees per se. Well, we don't. We don't have any employees at all, so we don't have to worry about that aspect.
Thank you. Yeah, governing documents are important. The other reason they're important, frankly, is just so you have clear guidance as to who decides what. And your default would be, I think at this point, your vestry decides everything. At some point, you have a rector, then the canons can kick in, but it's always useful to think through, have we sort of clarified so we don't end up in a position where we don't know who's deciding what, or someone's decided it, and we're not sure that was the right way to do it. Good governance is helpful. I think so. At this point,
I think we have about 15 minutes, maybe
Okay.
10 minutes, I'm not sure.
Perfect.
Where are we?
well, what I want to go to now,
15, 17 minutes.
oh, excellent. What I want to go to now is talking a little bit about the front lines. And if I can impose on you, Greg, to go to the slide with the statement, yeah, living, if you go back a few slides, I think there'll be the slide that says front lines somewhere on the top of it. It's about 6 slides back. As I mentioned this morning, the front lines, I think, are really not our churches. I think they're in other areas. They're students in public schools and public universities. They're public-facing ministries like soup kitchens and rescue missions. And then they're laity. They're the parishioners in the workplace. And I want us to be thinking about, how do we protect them? Now, the challenge here is that I don't think the legal standards are quite as clearly defined. They're also not as favorable as I would like. So it's a little bit more of an uphill battle. And I threw up on this slide some thoughts that I would describe as initial thoughts. I don't know if they're half-baked, quarter-baked, or fully baked, but to get us thinking about how to deal with these issues. So let me maybe run you through these, and then I'd like to open it up for some brainstorming. First of all, with regard to public schools, I think we need to just sort of spend some time culling out what are the challenges our students are facing in the public schools. I worship at the Falls Church Anglican. Our youth ministry did a wonderful meeting about 2 or 3 weeks ago, where they just invited the parents of students in the public schools to come in and say, what are you running into in your schools, so that we can be thinking about, how do we serve you? How do we help you? And we had just this great discussion. I mean, I actually sat there and never said a word, because the director of our children's ministry and Dan Murata, who's one of the priests who's here and is going to be church planning in Richmond, just facilitated this great conversation. So you had popcorning of what the problems were. Then you had some initial thoughts about ways to respond, but it was specifically presented as phase 1, and there'll be a second round. I think that's a great idea for how to approach these issues. Now, once you get them on the table, that there are these challenges, how do we respond to them? And as I said this morning, I think we need to change our mindset. Some churches think in terms of evacuating or escaping. I think we need to be talking about equipping and engaging. Equipping the saints to deal with these issues, and then engaging with the culture. So here are just a few thoughts. We need to theologically ground and disciple our students, our children, with a deep understanding of the gospel, of the nature of truth, of human reality, and of course of religious liberty as well. They are the evangelists, I was going to say of tomorrow, they're the evangelists of today. They're the ones who, when we see what God does in responding to this issue, they're going to be the people we look at and say, wow, isn't God amazing? Look what he's done. I also think there's a premium on parental engagement for the reasons that we've already talked about with regard to Fairfax County. So we need to engage with our children, our students. We need to be involved with them, talking with them, hearing about what they're encountering, encouraging them to respond, but often equipping them to actually carry their own water rather than us carrying that water for them. We need to be engaging their teachers. A teacher is going to be a lot more willing to listen to your request to opt out from something if they know you and what they've seen is, wow, you are really supportive, you are very helpful, you're really engaged, and you appreciate me as a teacher. So now when you come to me like Daniel saying, could I try a different approach? Could my student try a different approach? You come with credibility. They're more likely to engage that, to take that idea. You need to engage with school administrators and ultimately school boards. This is a difficult area. It was probably an area where we'll have to have some of us engage and the others just be profoundly grateful for those who are doing the heavy lifting, but we've got to be more involved. And then, of course, eternal vigilance. A month was enough to change a fundamental policy in Fairfax County. We're going to have to be on our guard. Now, I think the way our churches can equip is just what I was describing that the Falls Church did. Engage, have conversations, and get the parents talking to each other. As I mentioned this morning, I think one of the strategies it's not really a strategy, it's a way of relationship that we need to use across the board, is questions. There are many things that you cannot say as a statement that you can ask as a question. And communicators, those who teach on communication and rhetoric, will tell you one of the beauties of asking a question is the person comes to the conclusion themselves and then has the investment that it's their own idea. So, you know, Socrates is the great example. Jesus is a great example, often unrecognized. Questions engage, draw in, build relationship, show respect and courtesy, and often help people change their ways of thinking about something where they might have been locked in before. And then legally, I'd suggest just a few things. There is some guidance that the Department of Education put out in the 1990s about religious expression in public schools. It's available on the web. It's easy to get. Be familiar with that. That may help you when you go in to talk to a teacher or a principal. Its main distinction is voluntary student religious expression in the public schools is not just acceptable, it's actually in many ways constitutionally protected. Okay, and this is just a short summary of those two principles, that schools may not forbid students who are acting on their own from expressing their personal religious views or beliefs solely because their actions are religious, and schools may not discriminate against private religious expression by students, and instead must give them the same right to engage in religious activity as they have to engage in other forms of activity. Now, you can also think of the Federal Equal Access Act that came out in the 1980s. If you can have a chess club in a public school, you're supposed to be allowed to have any sort of religious club. In the private school, thanks to the CLS v. Martinez case of several years ago, that's a little bit different. So that's why universities like Vanderbilt or Ivy Leagues can do all sorts of really sad discrimination against religious perspectives. Ironically, it's because of the very First Amendment that they're now refusing to apply in their private setting. Next slide, please. Small businesses. Now, again, I want to get us thinking, what are the challenges we encounter? The examples that are on the front pages of the papers are bakers not wanting to bake cakes for certain religious ceremonies, photographers, people like that. I want to encourage us in two ways here. First, this is a prime example of where we need to be a Daniel. What do I mean by that? Well, pick battles wisely, and often it's better to let the battle come to you than to go looking for it. Great example, chapter 5, Belshazzar's feast. The text shows us Daniel is not at the feast. Daniel has to be summoned. He has to be sent for. In other words, Daniel was smart enough to say, this is a train wreck waiting to happen. This is no place for a follower of Christ. I'm going to be as far away. If they want me, they can send for me. And they did. He comes, they say, interpret the writing on the wall. He faithfully and accurately interprets it. They offer him gifts, and he says, no thanks. I want nothing to do with this. And he gets out of there. And I'm pretty sure that at the point where that night was Belshazzar slain, Daniel was at home in bed, thanking the Lord that he was not in the wrong place at the wrong time. I think it's a good principle for us. In your business, in all of the settings we're in, be very thoughtful. Where am I? Why am I there? Am I going into a situation that I would be better off just not being there for? Second point was the same one I made before. We need to have a deep understanding of religious liberty. We need to be able to articulate what it is, why it matters, and apropos of the question a few minutes ago, why it's of importance for everyone, why it's what protects the very people who are disagreeing with you. Third point, we need to communicate as winsomely as possible. I'm saddened that the cases that I read about religious expression in public workplaces are often the supervisor who had the coffee mug with the statement on it and got into a disagreement and then ended up fighting with someone about the coffee mug. Now, sometimes those cases are trumped up, so I don't want to mislead, but sometimes you think, you know, was it worth it over the coffee mug? Was that really the most effective way to share the love of Christ with this person? And we all need to be thinking, in my engagements with people, and am I engaging to confront or provoke or disagree, or am I engaging to show them the love of Christ and the truth of Christ and to bring them into that? And then the final point is recognize the main battlefront, particularly for a small business, may not be the legal issue, even though that's what's being talked about. And for that point, you need look no further than Indiana pizza parlors, because the business there almost shut down and became the maelstrom of center of a maelstrom of a controversy because a reporter asked one of their staff a question that had no relevance to the business or to the state RIFRA, that then created a social media buzz. And there are many times where what we need to think about is, I've prepared for my legal risks. Have I even thought about my communications risks? Have I thought about how I'm engaging with the community? And then legally, I'd give you 3 quick points. Be very familiar with the Hobby Lobby case, which said a business can engage in religious exercise. And think about, is that something that's applicable for me? You can even consider religious for-profit status. You could say we are a for-profit organization, but we are religious. The law in that area is still developing. There have been several cases that dealt with the question of whether a for-profit business could be a religious organization qualified for the Section 702 exemption. The cases that came out, one of them came out badly, but the reason it came out badly was lack of governing documents articulating a religious purpose. The court didn't say this is not legally possible. The court said you haven't proved it. And in the wake of Hobby Lobby, where the Supreme Court said a for-profit small business could engage in the exercise of religion, that's actually now the next step in that conversation. So think about that. And then the final point is, of course, get your documents in order. You don't want to have the legal issue decided in your favor and then lose because there's no proof that your small business is a religious business or has certain requirements. And you might do them religious requirements, you might just do certain conduct requirements. Think about it, but just I wanted to raise that question for you to be thinking about. Let me touch on one more point and then let's just open it up to discussion. What about the Christian in the secular workplace? I was talking to a good friend in our community group who works in an international development setting. And his comment was, I am actually afraid to talk about any of these issues in my workplace. And I have to tell you, this person, if you looked up reasonableness in the dictionary, you would find their picture. Winsome, gracious, kind. Some of you will know who I'm talking about even. He could not possibly have a rude conversation with anyone about anything. But his thought is just touching on the topic is dangerous in the secular workplace. And this is someone who has not been afraid to be in mission settings, to be in very difficult or challenging circumstances. Well, I think that's becoming more widespread. And the larger the organization you work for and the more outspoken on this issue they are, the more you feel that risk. So what can we do for our parishioners, our laity in those settings? Well, I think, again, it's the same principles from Daniel. And that one about staying away from royal feasts, avoiding the dangerous situations looms large. The other one that would loom large for me is pursuing consistent, quiet, faithful obedience. In Daniel chapter 6, when the command goes out to bow to the emperor and to no other God, the scriptures tell us there that Daniel went home, he opened his windows towards Jerusalem, and he prayed just as he had always done. He didn't change what he did when the law changed. He didn't make a demonstration or grandstand or pick a fight. He just kept being faithful. And I think for Christians in challenging secular workplaces, that's really the central principle we have to follow. Be faithful. Now, I wish I could give the guarantee if we're faithful, you won't go to the lion's den. But Daniel doesn't give us that option. And I wish I could give the guarantee that you'll go into the lion's den, but you will come out. And unfortunately, although Daniel is an example that you can come out, Daniel is not the example that you will come out. That may be the cost of obedience. But much better to enter the lion's den because we know God wanted us there. We were just being faithful, than to enter the lion's den because we were thinking, hey, I've always kind of wanted to be a test case. And then legally, just several recommendations. First of all, review the company's policies and handbooks, and especially look for the policy on religious accommodation, because employers have a duty under Title VII to reasonably accommodate the religious beliefs of their employees, as long as that doesn't cause an undue hardship to the employer. Now, the problem is undue hardship has been interpreted in a way that sets that bar fairly low. So employers can find lots of things that are undue hardships. But if you're familiar with that policy, you'll be more creative in thinking about what's the right way to tee up this issue? What's the right way to approach it? Also look at the harassment policy, both because you want to be careful that the way you talk to a fellow employee is not something that can be considered harassment under the policy, and also be aware that you may be the subject of harassment based on offensive comments directed at you because of your religious faith. If you know those going into a conversation, you're better equipped to then handle that conversation. And if you're a calm and winsome, faithful follower of Christ, if you're a Daniel, you'll be more likely to conduct that conversation well than the person arguing with you is likely to do. And so you may have a very good way to say, well, if anyone was harassing anyone here, I think that was the harassment. And it appears to have been based on my religious belief. Also review, there are some EEOC guidelines on religious discrimination in the workplace. And those are worth a look. I'm probably going to try and distill a few principles from those for sharing with folks in the diocese. But again, if you think you're running into a situation, I'd look at those. And then finally, the Daniel point, really be thinking about creative solutions. When you encounter what looks like an unsolvable problem, like Daniel, pray, really pray in your community with your friends, and then think creatively about what might happen. Cork, you just gave me the sign. Did I just use up our 15 minutes, or?
We probably have 3 minutes. They're supposed to be back in here and start, I think, in 5 minutes.
Okay.
So,
While people are coming in, I'd love to throw it open both to questions, but also to comments or thoughts. And my hope is get you all talking, and maybe next year our breakout session is I'm sitting listening, and you all are talking about what you've done and what you've thought about and the great ideas you've come up with. Paul?
grab that one. if you would.
Very quick question, Scott. You've given this beautiful teaching about Daniel. Was that written out anywhere we can get kind of the full exposition of the Daniel concept?
Thanks, Paul. It's kind of in my talking notes, so I can try and glean maybe some outline points from it and just share those more broadly, if that's helpful.
I like
Okay.
that too, yeah. Somebody else? Please,
Okay.
Krista.
In addition to, let's see, having that meeting for parents and students in the public school setting, were teachers present and have, maybe some teachers' needs or concerns, be it were addressed, or do you have anything about what that conversation may have looked like?
That's a great point, and one
That
that
coming from a teacher in a
Well,
private school.
And thank you. One that I did no justice to. My parents were both teachers, so I have a very soft spot. Teachers are in a different position because they are agents of the state, as it were. They're school employees, so they have much greater limitations. But they don't completely check their religious freedom rights at the door. And so I think the critical point for a teacher is always being clear, what hat am I wearing? When am I wearing my hat as public school employee, and when am I wearing my hat differently? And so a lot of times what a teacher in a public school setting has to do is to say, that's not something that's appropriate for me to talk with you about as a teacher, but if you wanted to get together for coffee on the weekend, I'd be happy to meet you over the weekend and talk about that just as a person, just like you. In those meetings, in a church setting, it is incredibly valuable to have a public school teacher present. The one I alluded to that at the Falls Church, our director of children's ministry was a public school teacher and actually had to teach the family life curriculum at one point. So as she was evoking these questions, she was doing it knowing what it was like on the front lines and having walked through that very, very faithfully. And interestingly, one of the families speaking had just completed a season at a major university doing graduate studies as RAs. And they had some marvelous suggestions about how they had dealt with the issue of gender identity in a respectful way that didn't compromise their witness as Christians about the nature of male and female. And part of it was just creatively talking about, well, we're not going to use pronouns that much. There's enormous pressure to use a new panoply of pronouns, which seems to change from school to school and which are difficult to remember. And what they said is, you know what? We're just going to talk to everyone using their name. And it may sound a little bit awkward, but it's a great way to say, I remember your name and I care about your name. and I'm addressing you as who you are.
I think people are probably hesitant to come in when we're still talking. Let me just thank you, Scott, and let's thank him together.